This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 8 of Season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, February 25th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. This week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. Cutter, our branch line conductor, has been detained at home this week with the grip. That is what we would call the flu. Mrs. Cutter has also had the same trouble, and it has been a sick household. Mrs. Sidney Wright has been having an attack of tonsillitis. The sincere sympathy of the Westford Friends goes out to the John P. Wright household in Lowell. Much sickness has been their portion this winter, and now their older daughter, Frances, is seriously sick with pneumonia. The Clarence A. Reed family, this one is spelled R-E-I-D, who have lived on the so-called Abel Fletcher place, which was on 52 Flag Road, for a number of years, have removed to Medford. Mr. and Mrs. Pearl Harmon, who lived at 73 Hilder Street, who have been spending the winter in Florida, are on their way home this week. The ladies of the Unitarian Church are arranging a pleasant affair to take place at this vestry on Wednesday afternoon of next week. There will be a food sale, also tables for the sale of candy and aprons. Reverend Benjamin Bailey will give readings, and there will be other entertainment. Afternoon tea will be served to all who come. The RFD carriers, that's Rural Free Delivery carriers, enjoyed the holiday Wednesday, which was Washington's birthday, having the day at home. A party of young people went to Littleton for the dual attractions of a hockey game and the sunset party at the town hall. About 14 of our residents enjoyed a theater trip to Lowell in the afternoon. At the Congregational Church Sunday morning, Reverend David Wallace gave a wise discourse on the power of personal influence. In the evening, a Francis Willard Memorial meeting in conjunction with the members of the WCTU was held. Francis Willard was an American educator, temperance reformer, and women's suffragist. She was the national president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1879 until her death in 1898. Houghton G. Osgood, Ida Trask, and Sadie McMaster attended the Christian Endeavor Convention at Concord Junction, now West Concord, on Washington's birthday. John Howard has been recently spending a few days with his brother and family in Concord, New Hampshire. He was interested to inspect his brother's new laboratory at the State House, where he is employed as state chemist. Mrs. John O'Brien fell on the ice the first of this week while hanging out clothes in her yard and broke her arm. Among the minor accidents, Willard Fletcher cut his left hand last Sunday, necessitating the assistance of Dr. Blaney with some stitches. The next section is called the Grange. The last regular meeting of the Grange was well attended, and the members voted in favor of continuing the gatherings of the North Middlesex Pomona Grange in the same central location in Lowell, in preference to meeting with the different Granges in the different towns in the jurisdiction. The lecturer's hour was in charge of Miss Edith Lawrence and Miss Bertha Norris, who had arranged a Valentine social. Partners for the Virginia Reel were chosen by matching numbered red paper hearts. The Grange Orchestra furnished music. At the next regular meeting, March 2nd, the three Graces, Ceres, Pomona, and Flora, will have charge of the program. Those are not women's names in town. Those are the names of Greek goddesses, and they were officers of the Grange. The next section is called Social. The social of the Congregational Church on Tuesday evening called out about 100 persons, older and younger, and was a pleasant and informal affair. Supper was served at 6:30 and was much enjoyed, although on a simple plan. A committee attended to a few substantial items. baked beans, rolls, coffee, and pickles, and the general's invitation for each family to bring pies and cakes met with good response. The entertainment consisted of graphophone selections by Mr. Merritt, vocal solos by Edson Boynton, Dr. Blaney, and Miss Ferguson, recitation Miss Daisy Cabell, and reading by Mr. David Wallace. Games followed the entertainment and were participated in with much spirit. Those in charge were Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, Mrs. Taylor, Mrs. Isles, Mrs. Lambert, and Mrs. Knight. Next we have the Tadmuck Club. The regular meeting of the Tadmuck Club took place Tuesday afternoon at Library Hall. There was a good attendance present. Reverend Benjamin Bailey was the speaker of the afternoon with, quote, the minister in fiction, end quote, for his subject. Thoroughly conversant with his subject, he gave his listeners an entertaining portrayal of many well-known characters in earlier as well as modern fiction, choosing from the works of, and then here he gives the authors, and I surmise the book, Charles Dickens, perhaps Reverend Septimus Crisparkle in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Oliver Goldsmith, probably the Vicar of Wakefield, Ian McLaren, Kate Carnegie and Those Ministers, Mrs. Humphrey Ward, Robert Ellesmere, Margaret Deland, John Ward, Preacher, Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, The Beechers, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Norwood or Village Life in New England, all of those had ministers in them, and others. It was a subject fully alive, giving his audience an afternoon quite worthwhile. Now that the daylight of the afternoon is more prolonged, the club voted to begin the meetings the rest of the season at 3 instead of at 2:30 o'clock. The next meeting will take place in the Unitarian Vestry at 3 o'clock. Miss Ellen A. Kimball of Worcester will lecture on the power of good reading. The next section is called Of Much Interest. The historical sketch by Edward A. Richardson in last week's issue was of much interest to many of our older residents as well as to those to whom many of the things referred to are matters of tradition. The names of Richardson, Layton, and Hall are all of interest to Westford people. The home of the three Layton brothers referred to was where W.J. Merritt now lives. That would be 62 Main Street. The site of the home of Reverend Willard Hall, Westford's first minister, was on the present Wheeler homestead, 66 Main Street. The Millerite movement, referred to in the article in the early 40s, 1840s obviously, had a good number of adherents in this town. A cellar hole with foundations in the north part of the town was the beginning of a Millerite chapel. Their zeal must have abated, for it never got beyond the foundations. The next section is the About Town section. J. Willard Fletcher mistook his hand for a piece of meat and proceeded to cut it accordingly. Owing to this mistake, he was obliged to issue marching orders to the direction of the skill of Dr. Blaney, who searched and soothed and sewed, and now where cut it has all growed. Mrs. Grace Sabine has been spending a few days at her father's, J. Willard Fletcher's, and attended the Unitarian Church last Sunday. Fred Daniels, formerly of the Edwin Haywood Farm, was in town last week calling on Chamberlain's Corner hospitality and old-time neighborly friendships. He is living at present in Malden. The Westford Board of Trade will hold a meeting at the Town Hall this evening. At a meeting of the registrars of voters last Friday evening, the following duties for future meetings prior to the annual town meeting were arranged for. At Brookside, Friday evening, March 3rd, Monday evening, March 6th at Healy's Hall, Graniteville, Wednesday evening, March 8th at Town Hall, Ford's Village, at Town Hall, Westford Center, Saturday, March 11th from 12 noon until 10 p.m. This was, of course, to register new voters so that they could vote in the upcoming election. The annual town meeting will occur Monday, March 20th, and the selectmen request all articles for the warrant to be handed in before Saturday, February 25th. The next paragraph is entitled Interesting Reading. The historical article in last week's Wardsman by Edward Richardson on, quote, the annals of a neighborhood, end quote, proved to be interesting and instructive reading in the many and varied points it covered. Wherever it unveiled Westford, it brought back to memory some of the many incidents in the history of the Millerite movement in town a little over a half-century ago. The annual Millerite camp meetings near Burgess Pond and the chapel near the Nutting Cemetery, now occupied by Ernest Dane, the refusal to harvest the autumn crops in which the overseers of the poor interfered, the selling and giving away of all property, and the congregating at one house and awaiting marching orders from the Lord, who has been detained on more important and sensible business and hasn't got around yet. The camp meetings gathered every extreme of belief and conduct, like in many respects the old-time military muster. The exhortations were terrifically, inspiringly loud, but here, as elsewhere, it gradually diminished in volume to a pollywog peep. The next paragraph is called Forbush the Auctioneer. A large gathering of men, boys, and one woman were present at the auction sale of cows at the Reed Farm on Monday afternoon. Otis Forbush of Acton, as auctioneer of experience and natural gift of price-getting, cried the sale in a tearless, fearless style. The stock was as tempting a lot for milking qualities, shapely built, color, and disposition as Westford has gathered into one herd since the days of the scrub cow made her farewell bow. Among the out-of-town cow dealers who were present and are widely known were Fred Kimball and Daniel Houghton of Littleton, Arthur Jones of Concord, Mr. Gordon of Harvard, Edwin Pirham, Emile Pagnon, Harry Green, Mr. Kapler of Chelmsford, and Westford's wealthy farmer, Henry O'Kies, was also smilingly reaching after the bargains. Next, we have the Forge Village section. The many friends of Charles Flanagan will be pained to hear of his illness at his home on Pond Street. On Wednesday evening at the usual hour, the Girls' Friendly Society held their regular meeting, after which a musical program was enjoyed. The choir of St. Andrew's Mission held a very pleasing rehearsal on Wednesday evening. Services were held in the mission on Saturday afternoon and were well attended. Mr. Bumpus preached an efficient sermon, which was thoroughly enjoyed by all his hearers. Miss Letitia Ward gave the members of her class in Cameron School and their friends a sleigh ride on last Saturday afternoon. The Ladies' Sewing Circle will hold a supper on Tuesday evening, February 28th, in Recreation Hall. After supper, a comedy sketch will be given by the Girls' Friendly Society and will be well worth patronizing. Come and have a good laugh, which will help digest the pancake supper. Dancing will be enjoyed the rest of the evening. A large number from this village attended the play given by the Groton schoolboys in Groton on Thursday evening. The infant child, her name was Gladys Bicknell, born February 3rd, 1911, of Mr. and Mrs. Fred Bicknell of Westford, was christened by Reverend Edmund T. Schofield in Abbott Hall on Sunday morning after service. Mrs. William Burnett celebrated her birthday last Sunday evening with a birthday party. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell are rejoicing over the arrival of a baby boy. His name was Raymond Mason, at their home on Monday, February 20th. Mrs. Mason and Miss Annie Catchpole, before her marriage, a former resident of this village. The presentation of the comedy drama, The Doctor's Mistake, written by John Boker of Lowell, which was to take place in Abbott Hall on Friday evening, is postponed, owing to the illness of some of the leading members of the cast. The home of Mr. Socha of Bradford Street was the scene on Tuesday afternoon of a very bold robbery. One of his boarders, an Austrian Pole, entered the room of the Mrs. Socha, that's S-O-C-H-A, opened their trunk and emptied it of the contents, taking over $400 in money. The affair was discovered on Tuesday night, but the culprit had skipped and cannot be found. The case has been reported to the police, and it is hoped that some trace of the missing thief may be found. Many from this village are to attend the dance in Healy's Hall, Graniteville, on Sunday evening, given by St. Catherine's Temperance Society. The next section is called The Trot. The horse racing on Forge Pond last Saturday afternoon attracted one of the largest crowds ever seen in this village at one particular location. There were over 500 people who came from Graniteville, Westford, Littleton, Gordon, Groton, Ayer, West Acton, Bedford, and Lowell, and other surrounding towns. The racing, which was run on racing rules, began a little after 2:30 o'clock and was open only to Graniteville and Westford and Littleton. The conditions of the race were to be the best 3 out of 5 on a course 1/4 of a mile in length, and the decisions were given by 3 judges: Charles Brooks of Graniteville, Wally Gardner of West Acton, and Douglas Whitcomb of Littleton. Dr. Murray of Littleton officiated as starter and was assisted by Elmer Nutting and Francis Lowther of this village. Those who entered the race were Austin Healy's little mare Dolly, Henry Healy's big chestnut Joe, driven by Henry Harrington, William Yapp's dark bay pacer, Angus MacDonald's chestnut, Hugh MacDonald's dark bay, Dr. Blaning's black, and Charles Yapp's sorrel. Mr. Yapp, with his gray, came ready to join in the race, but his horse, while warming up, cut his foot. The race resulted in Henry Healy's chestnut, driven by Henry Harrington of Graniteville, winning in 3 heats, thus capturing the first prize, a high-grade horse blanket. Austin Healy's Dolly came in second, winning the second prize, a whalebone whip. The third prize, a halter, was awarded William Yapp's dark bay. The prizes were put up by the lovers of sports in this village who subscribed for them. The track was in very poor condition, the ice having become softened by the warm weather to slush, which made the going very heavy and acted as a drawback to the lighter horses, but very much to the advantage of Hungry Joe, Henry Healy's horse. Joe certainly, quote, ate up the track in a manner befitting his name. The race for second place was very close, Yapp's Bay keeping well up with Dolly, who at the finish nosed him out. Dr. Blaney's horse showed up fine and was heartily cheered for his efforts. He certainly showed that had he been in practice and the ice had been in better condition, he would have given them all a good race for the money. This afternoon, another race will be held to be run under practically the same conditions, to be open to Graniteville, Westford, Littleton, and Groton. It is hoped that Groton will take advantage of this race. Prizes will be offered, as last week, to the winners. The next section is entitled A Social Dance. The RTS Club held another of their social dances on Saturday evening in Abbott Hall. Music for dancing was furnished by Gilmore's Orchestra from Lowell, and ice cream was served during intermission. The young men in charge of the fair were Dick Spinner, general manager, William Gooddale, assistant, Dola Dumont, floor director, Jack Spinner, B. Smith, B. Orr, C. Jacklin, P. Lord, and other members of the club as aides. The hall was lighted by electricity for the first time, which is a decided improvement over the oil lights formerly used. These electric lights will be greatly appreciated by all who have occasion to use and visit Abbott Hall. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending February 25th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford CAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.